Hello there, and welcome to this episode of Down to Sleep, the softly spoken podcast of bedtime stories and audiobooks to help you get the rest that you deserve. Tonight is a reading of The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgeson Burnett with relaxing rain sounds in the background. Please do hit that like and subscribe, and maybe leave a comment about what book you would like to hear next to help this channel grow. If you'd like to join my sleepy little book club and hear everything first and get access to more than 330 episodes right now, you can join me on Patreon at patreon.com/downtosleep. For the price of a couple of cups of coffee, you get access to every single episode so far, including exclusive books that I'm no longer able to share on YouTube. But for now, let's go ahead and tuck you in. Take a nice deep breath for me. And let's get down to sleep. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgeson Burnett. But they were obliged to wait more than a week, because first there came some very windy days, and then Coraline was threatened with a cold, which two things happening one after the other would no doubt have thrown him into a rage. But that there was so much careful and mysterious planning to do, and almost every day Dickon came in, if only for a few minutes, to talk about what was happening on the moor, and in the lanes and hedges, and on the borders of streams. The things he had to tell about otters and badgers and water rats' houses, not to mention birds' nests and field mice in their burrows, were enough to make you almost tremble with excitement when you heard all of those intimate details from an animal charmer, and realized with what thrilling eagerness and anxiety the whole busy underworld was working. "They're same as us," said Dickon, "only they have to build their homes every year, and it keeps them so busy they're fair scuffle to get them done." The most absorbing thing, however, was the preparations to be made before Colin could be transported with sufficient secrecy to the garden. No one must see the chair carriage and Dickon and Mary after they turned a certain corner of the shrubbery and entered upon the walk outside the ivied walls. As each day passed, Colin had become more and more fixed in his feeling that the mystery surrounding the garden was one of its greatest charms. Nothing must spoil that. No one must ever suspect that they had a secret. People must think that he was simply going out with Mary and Dickon because he liked them and did not object to their looking at him. They had long and quite delightful talks about their route. They would go up this path and down that one and cross the other, and go round among the fountain flower beds, as if they were looking at the bedding out plants the head gardener, Mr. Roach, had been having arranged. That would seem such a rational thing to do that no one would think it at all mysterious. They would turn into the shrubbery walks and lose themselves until they came to the long walls. It was almost as serious and elaborately thought out as the plans of march made by great generals in time of war. Rumours of the new and curious things which were occurring in the invalid's apartment had of course filtered through the servants' hall, into the stable yards and out among the gardeners. But notwithstanding this, Mr. Roach was startled one day when he received orders from Master Colin's room to the effect that he must report himself in the apartment no outsider had ever seen. The invalid himself desired to speak to him. "Well, well," he said to himself as he hurriedly changed his coat. "What's to do now? His Royal Highness, that wasn't to be looked at, calling up a man he's never set eyes on." Mr. Roach was not without curiosity. He had never caught even a glimpse of the boy, and had heard a dozen exaggerated stories about his uncanny looks and ways and his insane tempers. The thing he had heard oftenest was that he might die at any moment, and there had been numerous fanciful descriptions of a humped back and helpless limbs, given by people who had never seen him. "Things are changing in this house, Mr. Roach," said Mrs. Medlock. She led him up the back staircase to the corridor, onto which opened the hitherto mysterious chamber. "Let's hope they're changing for the better, Mrs. Medlock," he answered. "They couldn't well change for the worse," she continued. "And clear as it all is, there's them as finds their duties made a lot easier to stand up under. Don't you be surprised, Mr. Roach, if you find yourself in the middle of a menagerie, and Martha Sowerby's Dickon more at home than you or me could ever be." There really was a sort of magic about Dickon, as Mary always privately believed. When Mr. Roach heard his name, he smiled quite leniently. "He'd be at home in Buckingham Palace or at the bottom of coal mine," he said. "And yet it's not impudence either. He's just fine, is that lad." It was perhaps well he had been prepared, or he might have been startled. When the bedroom door was opened, a large crow, which seemed quite at home perched on the high back of a carven chair, announced the entrance of a visitor by saying "caw, caw" quite loudly. In spite of Mrs. Medlock's warning, Mr. Roach only just escaped being sufficiently undignified to jump backward. The young Rajah was neither in bed nor on his sofa. He was sitting in an armchair, and a young lamb was standing by him, shaking its tail in feeding lamb fashion, as Dickon knelt giving it milk from its bottle. A squirrel was perched on Dickon's bent back, attentively nibbling a nut. The little girl from India was sitting on a big footstool looking on. "Here is Mr. Roach, Master Colin," said Mrs. Medlock. The young Rajah turned and looked his servitor over. At least that was what the head gardener felt happened. "Oh, you are Roach, are you?" he said. "I sent for you to give you some very important orders." "Very good, sir," answered Roach, wondering if he was to receive instructions to fell all the oaks in the park or to transform the orchards into water gardens. "I'm going out in my chair this afternoon," said Colin. "If the fresh air agrees with me, I may go out every day. When I go, none of the gardeners are to be anywhere near the long walk by the garden walls. No one is to be there. I shall go out about 2 o'clock, and everyone must keep away until I send word that they may go back to their work." "Very good, sir," replied Mr. Roach, much relieved to hear that the oaks might remain, and that the orchards were safe. "Mary," said Colin, turning to her, "what's that thing you say in India when you finish talking and you want people to go?" "You say, 'You have my permission to go,'" answered Mary. The Rajah waved his hand. "You have my permission to go, Roach," he said. "But remember, this is very important." "Caw, caw," remarked the crow, hoarsely but not impolitely. "Very good, sir. Thank you, sir," said Mr. Roach, and Mrs. Medlock took him out of the room. Outside in the corridor, being a rather good-natured man, he smiled until he almost laughed. "My word," he said, "he's got a fine lordly way with him, hasn't he? You'd think he was a whole royal family rolled into one, prince consort and all." "Hey," protested Mrs. Medlock, "we've had to let him trample all over every one of us ever since he had feet, and he thinks that's what folks are born for." "Perhaps he'll grow out of it if he lives," suggested Mr. Roach. "Well, there's one thing that's pretty sure," said Mrs. Medlock. "If he does live and that Indian child stays here, I'll warrant she teaches him that the whole orange does not belong to him, as Susan Sowerby says. And he'll be likely to find out the size of his own quarter." Inside the room, Colin was leaning back on his cushions. It's all safe now, he said. And this afternoon I shall see it. This afternoon I shall be in it. Dickon went back to the garden with his creatures, and Mary stayed with Colin. She did not think he looked tired, but he was very quiet before their lunch came, and he was quiet while they were eating it. She wondered why and asked him about it. "What big eyes you've got, Colin," she said. "When you're thinking, they get as big as saucers. What are you thinking about now?" "I can't help thinking about what it will look like," he answered. "The garden?" asked Mary. "The springtime," he said. "I was thinking that I've really never seen it before. I scarcely ever went out, and when I did go, I never looked at it. I didn't even think about it." "I never saw it in India because there wasn't any," said Mary. Shut in and morbid as his life had been, Colin had more imagination than she had, and at least he had spent a good deal of time looking at wonderful books and pictures. "That morning when you ran in and said, 'It's come, it's come,' you made me feel quite queer. It sounded as if things were coming with a great procession and big bursts and wafts of music. I've a picture like it in one of my books. Crowds of lovely people and children with garlands and branches with blossoms on them. Everyone laughing, dancing, crowding and playing on pipes. That was why I said, 'Perhaps we shall hear golden trumpets,' and told you to throw open the window." "How funny," said Mary. "It's really just what it feels like. And if all the flowers and leaves and green things and birds and wild creatures danced past at once, what a crowd it would be. I'm sure they'd dance and sing and flute, and that would be wafts of music." They both laughed, but it was not because the idea was laughable, but because they both so liked it. A little later, the nurse made Colin ready. She noticed that instead of lying like a log while his clothes were put on, he sat up and made some efforts to help himself. He talked and laughed with Mary all the time. "This is one of his good days, sir," she said to Dr. Craven, who dropped in to inspect him. "He's in such good spirits that it makes him stronger." "I'll call in again later in the afternoon, after he's come in," said Dr. Craven. "I must see how the going out agrees with him." "I wish," in a very low voice, he said, "that he would let you go with him." "I'd rather give up the case this moment, sir, than even stay here while it's suggested," answered the nurse with sudden firmness. "I hadn't really decided to suggest it," said the doctor with slight nervousness. "We'll try the experiment. Dickon's a lad I'd trust with a newborn child." The strongest footman in the house carried Colin downstairs and put him in his wheeled chair, near which Dickon waited outside. After the manservant had arranged his rugs and cushions, the Rajah waved his hand to him and to the nurse. "You have my permission to go," he said, and they both disappeared quickly, and it must be confessed giggled when they were safely inside the house. Dickon began to push the wheeled chair slowly and steadily. Mistress Mary walked beside it, and Colin leaned back and lifted his face to the sky. The arch of it looked very high, and the small snowy clouds seemed like white birds floating on outspread wings below its crystal blueness. The wind swept in soft, big breaths down from the moor. It was strange, with a wild, clear, scented sweetness. Colin kept lifting his thin chest to draw it in. His big eyes looked as if it were they which were listening instead of his ears. "There are so many sounds of singing and humming and calling out," he said. "What is that scent the puffs of wind bring?" "It's gorse on the moor that's opening out," answered Dickon. "Hey, the bees are at it wonderful today." Not a human creature was to be caught sight of in the paths they took. In fact, every gardener or gardener's lad had been witched away. They wound in and out among the shrubbery and out and round the fountain beds, following their carefully planned route for the mere mysterious pleasure of it. But when at last they turned into the long walk by the ivied walls, the excited sense of an approaching thrill made them, for some curious reason, speak in whispers. "This is it," breathed Mary. "This is where I used to walk up and down and wonder and wonder." "Is it?" cried Colin, and his eyes began to search the ivy with eager curiousness. "But I can see nothing," he whispered. "There is no door." "That's what I thought," said Mary. Then there was a lovely breathless silence, and the chair wheeled on. "That's the garden where Ben Weatherstaff works," said Mary. "Is it?" said Colin. A few yards more, and Mary whispered again. "This is where the robin flew over the wall." "Is it?" cried Colin. "Oh, I wish he'd come again." "And that," said Mary with solemn delight, pointing under a big lilac bush, "is where he perched on the little heap of earth and showed me the key." Then Colin sat up. "Where? There," he cried. His eyes were as big as the wolf's in Red Riding Hood, when Red Riding Hood felt called upon to remark on them. Dickon stood still, and the wheeled chair stopped. "And this," said Mary, stepping onto the bed close to the ivy, "is where I went to talk to him when he chirped at me from the top of the wall. And this is the ivy the wind blew back." She took a hold of the hanging green curtain. "Oh, is it? Is it?" gasped Colin. "And here is the handle. And here is the door. Dickon, push him in quickly." And Dickon did it with one strong, steady, splendid push. Colin had actually dropped back against his cushions. Even though he gasped with delight, he'd covered his eyes with his hands and held them there, shutting out everything until they were inside. The chair stopped as if by magic, and the door was closed. Not till then did he take them away and look round and round and round, as Dickon and Mary had done. And over walls and earth and trees and swinging sprays and tendrils the fair green veil of tender little leaves had crept. And in the grass under the trees, and the grey urns in the alcoves, and here and there everywhere, with touches or splashes of gold and purple, white. The trees were showing pink and snow above his head, and there were fluttering of wings and faint sweet pipes, humming and scents and scents. The sun fell warm upon his face, like a hand with a lovely touch, and in wonder, Mary and Dickon stood and stared at him. He looked so strange and different because a pink glow of colour had actually crept all over him, ivory face and neck and hands and all. "I shall get well, I shall get well," he cried out. "Mary, Dickon, I shall get well, and I shall live forever and ever and ever." One of the strange things about living in the world is that it is only now and then one is quite sure one is going to live forever and ever and ever. One knows it sometimes when one gets up at the tender, solemn dawn time and goes out and stands alone and throws one's head far back, looks up and watches the pale sky slowly changing, flushing, marvelous unknown things happening until the east almost makes one cry out. One's heart stands still at the strange unchanging majesty of the rising of the sun. It's been happening every morning for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. One knows it then for a moment or so, and one knows it sometimes when one stands by oneself in a wood at sunset, and the mysterious, deep gold stillness slanting through and under the branches seems to be saying slowly again and again something one cannot quite hear, however much one tries. Then sometimes the immense quiet of the dark blue at night, with millions of stars waiting and watching, makes one sure. Sometimes a sound of far-off music makes it true, and sometimes a look in someone's eyes. And it was like that with Colin when he first saw and heard and felt the springtime inside the 4 high walls of a hidden garden. That afternoon, the whole world seemed to devote itself to being perfect, radiantly beautiful and kind to one boy. Perhaps out of pure heavenly goodness, the spring came and crowned everything it possibly could into that one place. More than once, Dickon paused in what he was doing and stood still with a sort of growing wonder in his eyes, shaking his head softly. "Hey, it's Gradley," he said. "I'm 12 going on 13, and there's a lot of afternoons in 13 years. Seems to me like I never seed one as Gradley as this year." "Aye, it is a Gradley one," said Mary, and she sighed for mere joy. "I'll warrant it's the Gradlest one as ever was in this world." "Does thou think," said Colin, with a dreamy carefulness, "as happen it was made like this here all the purpose for me?" "My word," cried Mary admiringly, "that there is a bit of good Yorkshire. Thou'rt shaping first rate, that thou art." And delight reigned. They drew the chair under the plum tree, which was snow white with blossoms and musical with bees. It was like a king's canopy, of fairy kings. There were flowering cherry trees near and apple trees whose buds were pink and white. And here and there, one had burst open wide. Between the blossoming branches of the canopy, bits of blue sky looked down like wonderful eyes. Mary and Dickon worked a little here and there, and Colin watched them. They brought him things to look at, buds which were opening, buds which were tight closed, bits of twig whose leaves were just showing green, the feather of a woodpecker which had dropped on the grass, the empty shell of some bird early hatched. Dickon pushed the chair slowly round and round the garden, stopping every other moment to let him look at the wonders springing out of the earth or trailing down from trees. It was like being taken in state round the country of a magic king and queen, shown all the mysterious riches it contained. "I wonder if we shall see the robin," said Colin. "I'll see him often enow after a bit. When the eggs hatches out, the little chap will be kept so busy it'll make his head swim. I'll see him flying backward and forward, carrying worms nigh as big as himself. That much noise going on in nest when he gets there as fair flusters him. He scarce knows which big mouth to drop for his piece in. Gaping beaks and squeaks on every side. Mother says as when she sees the worker Robin has to keep them gaping beaks filled, she feels like she was a lady with nothing to do. She says she's seen the little chaps when it seemed like sweat must be dropping off them, though folks can't see it. This made them giggle so delightedly that they were obliged to cover their mouths with their hands, remembering that they must not be heard. Colin had been instructed as to the law of whispers and low voices several days before. He liked the mysteriousness of it and did his best, but in the midst of excited enjoyment it is rather difficult never to laugh above a whisper. Every moment of the afternoon was full of new things, and every hour the sunshine grew more golden. The wheeled chair had been drawn back under the canopy, and Dickon had sat down on the grass and had just drawn out his pipe, when Colin saw something he had not had time to notice before. "That's a very old tree over there, isn't it?" he said. Dickon looked across the grass at the tree, and Mary looked, and there was a brief moment of stillness. "Yes," answered Dickon after it, and his low voice had a very gentle sound. Mary gazed at the tree and thought. "The branches are quite grey and there's not a single leaf anywhere," Colin went on. "It's quite dead, isn't it?" "Aye," admitted Dickon. "But them roses as has climbed all over it will near hide every bit of the dead wood when they're full of leaves and flowers. It won't look dead then. It'll be the prettiest of all." Mary still gazed at the tree and thought. "It looks as if a big branch has broken off," said Colin. "I wonder how it was done." "It's been done many a year," answered Dickon. "Hey," with a sudden relieved start and laying his hand on Colin. "Look at that robin. There he is. He's been foraging for his mate." Colin was almost too late, but he just caught sight of him. The flash of red-breasted bird with something in his beak. He darted through the greenness and into the close-grown corner and was out of sight. Colin leaned back on his cushion again, laughing a little. "He's taking her tea to her. Perhaps it's 5 o'clock. I think I'd like some tea myself." And so they were safe. "It was magic which sent the robin," said Mary secretly to Dickon afterward. "I know it was magic." For both she and Dickon had been afraid Colin might ask something about the tree whose branch had broken off 10 years ago. They had talked it over together, and Dickon had stood and rubbed his head in a troubled way. "We mun look as if it wasn't no different from other trees. We couldn't never tell him how it broke, poor lad. If he says anything about it, we mun. We mun try to look cheerful." "Aye, that we mun," had answered Mary, but she had not felt as if she looked cheerful when she gazed at the tree. She wondered, and wondered in those few moments if there was any reality in that other thing Dickon had said. He had gone on rubbing his rust-red hair in a puzzled way, but a nice, comforted look had begun to grow in his blue eyes. "Mrs. Craven was a very lovely young lady," he gone on, rather hesitating. "And Mother, she thinks maybe she's about Misselthwaite many a time looking after Master Colin. Same as all mothers do when they're took out world. They have to come back, thou sees. Happen she's been in garden, and happen it was her set us to work, and to bring him here." Mary had thought he meant something about magic. She was a great believer in magic. Secretly, she quite believed that Dickon worked magic, Of course, good magic, on everything near him, and that was why people liked him so much, and wild creatures knew he was their friend. She wondered indeed if it were not possible that his gift had brought the robin just at the right moment when Colin asked that dangerous question. She felt that his magic was working all the afternoon and making Colin look like an entirely different boy. It did not seem possible that he could be the crazy creature who had screamed and beaten and bitten his pillow. Even his ivory whiteness seemed to change. The faint glow of colour, which had shone on his face and neck and hands when he first got inside the garden, really never quite died away. He looked as if he were made of flesh instead of ivory or wax. They saw the robin carry food to his mate 2 or 3 times, and it was so suggestive of afternoon tea that Colin felt they must have some. "Go and make one of the men servants bring some in a basket to the rhododendron walk," he said, "and then you and Dickon can bring it here." It was an agreeable idea, easily carried out, and when the white cloth was spread upon the grass with hot tea and buttered toast and crumpets, a delightfully hungry meal was eaten. Several birds on domestic errands paused to inquire what was going on, and were led into investigating crumbs with great activity. Nut and shell whisked up trees with pieces of cake. Soot took the entire half of a buttered crumpet into a corner and pecked and examined and turned it over and made hoarse remarks about it, until he decided to swallow it all joyfully in one gulp. The afternoon was dragging towards its mellow hour. The sun was deepening the gold of its lances. The bees were going home. The birds were flying past less often. Dickon and Mary were sitting on the grass. The tea basket was repacked, ready to be taken back to the house. And Colin was lying against his cushions with his heavy locks pushed back from his forehead, his face looking quite a natural colour. "I don't want this afternoon to go," he said, "but I shall come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after." "You'll get plenty of fresh air, won't you?" said Mary. "I'm going to get nothing else," he answered. "I've seen the spring now, and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow in here. I'm going to grow here myself." "That thou will," said Dickon. "Us'll have thee walking about here and digging same as other folk afore long." Colin flushed tremendously. "Walk," he said. "Dig. Shall I?" Dickon's glance at him was delicately cautious. Neither he nor Mary had ever asked if anything was the matter with his legs. "For sure thou will," he said stoutly. Thou's got legs of thine own, same as other folks." Mary was rather frightened until she heard Colin's answer. "Nothing really ails them," he said, "but they're so thin and weak, they shake, so that I'm afraid to try to stand on them." Both Mary and Dickon drew a relieved breath. "When thou stops being afraid, I'll stand on 'em," Dickon said with renewed cheer, "and thou'll stop being afraid in a bit." "I shall," said Colin, and he lay still as if he were wondering about things. They were really very quiet for a little while. The sun was dropping lower. It was that hour when everything stills itself. And they really had a busy and exciting afternoon. Colin looked as if he were resting luxuriously. Even the creatures had ceased moving about and had drawn together and were resting near them. Soot had perched on a low branch and drawn up one leg and dropped the grey film drowsily over his eyes. Mary privately thought he looked as if he might snore in a minute. In the midst of this stillness, it was rather startling when Colin half lifted his head and exclaimed in a loud, suddenly alarmed whisper, "Who is that man?" Dickon and Mary scrambled to their feet. "Man," they both cried in low, quick voices. Colin pointed to the high wall. "Look," he whispered excitedly. "Just look." Mary and Dickon wheeled about and looked. There was Ben Weatherstaff's indignant face, glaring at them over the wall from the top of a ladder. He actually shook his fist at Mary. "If I wasn't a back elder and thou was a wench o' mine," he cried, "I'd give thee a hidin'." He mounted another step threateningly, as if it were his energetic intention to jump down and deal with her. But as she came toward him, he evidently thought better of it, and stood on the top step of the ladder, shaking his fist down at her. "I never thought much o' thee," he harangued. "I couldna abide thee the first time I set eyes on thee. A scrawny, buttermilk-faced young besom, allus asking questions and poking the nose where it wasna wanted. I never knowed how they got so thick with me. If it hadn't been for the robin, drat him." "Ben Weatherstaff," called out Mary, finding her breath. She stood below him and called up to him with a sort of gasp. "Ben Weatherstaff, it was the robin who showed me the way." Then it did seem as if Ben really would scramble down on her side of the wall. He was so outraged. "Tha young bad un," he called down at her, "layin' tha badness on a robin. Not but what he's impident enow for anything. Him showing thee the way, him, young nowt." She could see his next words burst out because he was overpowered by curiosity. "However in this world did thou get in?" "It was the robin that showed me the way," she protested. "You didn't know he was doing it, but he did. And I can't tell you from here while you're shaking your fist at me." He stopped shaking his fist very suddenly at that very moment, and his jaw actually dropped as he stared over her head at something that he saw coming over the grass toward him. At the first sound of his torrent of words, Colin had been so surprised that he had only sat up and listened as if he were spellbound. But in the midst of it, he had recovered himself and beckoned imperiously to Dickon. "Wheel me over there," he commanded. "Wheel me quite close and stop right in front of him." And this, if you please, this is what Ben Weatherstaff beheld, which made his jaw drop. A wheeled chair with luxurious cushions and robes which came toward him looking rather like some sort of state coach, because a young Rajah leaned back in it with royal command in his great black-rimmed eyes, a thin white hand extended haughtily toward him. It stopped right under Ben Weatherstaff's nose. It was really no wonder his mouth dropped open. "Do you know who I am?" demanded the Rajah. How Ben Weatherstaff stared. His red old eyes fixed themselves on what was before him as if he was seeing a ghost. He gazed and gulped a lump down his throat and did not say a word. "Do you know who I am?" demanded Colin still more imperiously. "Answer." Ben Weatherstaff put his gnarled hand up and passed it over his eyes and over his forehead, and then he did answer in a queer, shaky voice. "Who thou art," he said. "Aye, that I do, with thy mother's eyes staring at me out of thy face. Lord knows how thou come here, but thou art the poor cripple." Colin forgot that he had ever had a back. His face flushed scarlet and he sat bolt upright. "I'm not a cripple," he cried out furiously. "I'm not." "He's not," cried Mary, almost shouting up the wall in fierce indignation. "He's not got a lump as big as a pin. I looked. There was none there, not one." Ben Weatherstaff passed his hand over his forehead again and gazed as if he could never gaze enough. His hand shook and his mouth shook and his voice shook. He was an ignorant old man and a tactless old man, and he could only remember the things he had heard. Thar hasn't got a crooked back," he said hoarsely. "No," shouted Colin. Thar hasn't got crooked legs," quavered Ben more hoarsely yet. It was too much. The strength with which Colin usually threw into his tantrums rushed through him now in a new way. Never yet had he been accused of crooked legs, even in whispers. The perfectly simple belief in their existence, which was revealed by Ben Weatherstaff's voice, was more than Raja flesh and blood could endure. His anger and insulted pride made him forget everything but this one moment. It filled him with a power he had never known before, an almost unnatural strength. "Come here," he shouted to Dickon. He actually began to tear the coverings off his lower limbs and disentangle himself. "Come here this minute." Dickon was by his side in a second. Mary caught her breath in a short gasp and felt herself turn pale. "He can do it. He can do it. He can do it. He can." She gabbed over to herself under her breath as fast as she ever could. There was a brief, fierce scramble. The rugs were tossed on the ground. Dickon held Colin's arm. The thin legs were out. The thin feet were on the grass. Colin was standing upright. Upright, as straight as an arrow and looking strangely tall. His head thrown back and his strange eyes flashing lightning. "Look at me," he flung up at Ben Weatherstaff. "Just look at me, you. Just look at me." "He's as straight as I am," cried Dickon. "He's as straight as any lad of Yorkshire." What Ben Weatherstaff did, Mary thought queer beyond measure. He choked and gulped, and suddenly tears ran down his weather-wrinkled cheeks as he struck his old hands together. "Hey," he burst forth. "The lies folk tells. Thou as thin as a lath and as white as a wraith, but there's not a knob on thee. Thou'lt make 'em on yet. God bless thee." Dickon held Colin's arm strongly, but the boy had not begun to falter. He stood straighter, and he looked Ben Weatherstaff in the face. "I'm your master," he said. "When my father is away, and you are to obey me, this is my garden. Don't dare to say a word about it. You get down from that ladder and go out to the long walk, and Miss Mary will meet you and bring you here. I want to talk to you. We did not want you, but now you will have to be in on the secret. Be quick." Ben Weatherstaff's crabbed old face was still wet with that one queer rush of tears. It seemed as if he could not take his eyes from thin, straight Colin standing on his feet with his head thrown back. "Hey, lad," he almost whispered. "Hey, my lad." And then remembering himself, he suddenly touched his gardener fashion and said, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir," and obediently disappeared as he descended the ladder. When his head was out of sight, Colin turned to Mary. "Go and meet him," he said. and Mary flew across the grass to the door under the ivy. Dickon was watching him with sharp eyes. There were scarlet spots on his cheeks and he looked amazing, but he showed no signs of falling. "I can stand," he said, and his head was still held up and he said it quite grandly. "I told thee thou could as soon as thou stopped being afraid," answered Dickon. "And thou stopped." "Yes, I've stopped," said Colin. Then suddenly he remembered something Mary had said. "Are you making magic?" he asked sharply. Dickon's curly mouth spread in a cheerful grin. "Thou's doing magic thysel," he said. "It's same magic as made these here work out of the earth." He touched with his thick boot a clump of crocuses in the grass. Colin looked down at them. "Aye," he said slowly. "There couldna be bigger magic than that there. There couldna be." He drew himself up straighter than ever. "I'm going to walk to that tree," he said, pointing to one a few feet away from him. "I'm going to be standing when Weatherstaff comes here. I can rest against the tree if I like. When I want to sit down, I will sit down, but not before. Bring a rug from the chair." He walked to the tree, and though Dickon held his arm, he was wonderfully steady. When he stood against the tree trunk, it was not too plain that he supported himself against it, and he still held himself so straight that he looked tall. When Ben Weatherstaff came through the door in the wall, he saw him standing there, and he heard Mary muttering something under her breath. "What art saying?" he asked rather testily, because he did not want his attention distracted from the long, thin, straight boy figure and proud face. But she did not tell him. What she was saying was this: "You can do it. You can do it. I told you you could. You can do it. You can do it. You can." She was saying it to Colin because she wanted to make magic and keep him on his feet looking like that. She could not bear that he should give in before Ben Weatherstaff. He did not give in. She was uplifted by a sudden feeling that he looked quite beautiful in spite of his thinness. He fixed his eyes on Ben Weatherstaff in his funny, imperious way. "Look at me," he commanded. "Look at me all over. Am I a hunchback? Have I got crooked legs?" Ben Weatherstaff had not quite got over his emotion, but he had recovered a little, and answered almost in his usual way. "Not thar," he said. "Nowt of the sort. What's thou been doing with thyself? Hiding out of sight, letting folk think thou was a cripple and half-witted." "Half-witted?" said Colin angrily. "Who thought that?" "Lots of fools," said Ben. "The world's full of jackasses' brain, and they never brain nowt but lies. What did thou shut thyself up for?" "Everyone thought I was going to die," said Colin. "I'm not." He said it with such decision Ben Weatherstaff looked him over, up and down and up. "Thou die," he said, with dry exultation. "Nowt of the sort. Thou's got too much pluck in thee. When I seed thee put thy legs on the ground in such a hurry, I knowed thou was all right. Sit thee down on the rug a bit, young master. Give me thy orders." There was a queer mixture of crabbed tenderness and shrewd understanding in his manner. Mary had poured out speech as rapidly as she could as they had come down the long walk. The chief thing to be remembered, she had told him, was that Colin was getting well. Getting well. The garden was doing it. No one must let him remember about having humps and dying. The Rajah condescended to seat himself on a rug under the tree. "What work do you do in the gardens, Weatherstaff?" he inquired. "Anything I'm told to do," answered old Ben. "I'm kept on by favour, 'cause she liked me." "She," said Colin. "The mother," answered Ben Weatherstaff. "My mother," said Colin, and he looked about him quietly. This was her garden, wasn't it? Aye, it was that. And Ben Weatherstaff looked about him too. She remained fond of it. It is my garden now. I am fond of it. I shall come here every day, announced Colin. But it is to be a secret. My orders are that no one is to know that we come here. Dickon and my cousin have worked and made it come alive. I shall send for you sometimes to help, but you must come when no one can see you. Ben Weatherstaff's face twisted itself in a dry old smile. I've come here before when no one can see me, he said. What? Exclaimed Colin. When? The last time I was here, rubbing his chin and looking round. About 2 years ago. But no one's been in it for 10 years, cried Colin. There was no door. I'm no one, said old Ben dryly. And I didn't come through door. I come over the wall. The rheumatics held me back last 2 year. I come and did a bit of pruning, cried Dickon. I couldn't make out how it had been done. She was so fond of it, she was, said Ben Weatherstaff slowly. And she was such a pretty young thing. She says to me once, Ben, she says, laughing, if ever I'm ill, or if I go away, you must take care of my roses. When she did go away, the orders was no one was ever to come nigh, but I come. Over the wall I come until the rheumatics stopped me. And I did a bit of work once a year. She had gave her order first. It wouldn't have been as wick as it is if thou hadn't done it, said Dickon. I did wonder. I'm glad you did it, Weatherstaff, said Colin. You'll know how to keep the secret. Aye, I'll know, sir. And it'll be easier for a man with rheumatics to come in at door. On the grass near the tree, Mary had dropped her trowel. Colin stretched out his hand and took it up. An odd expression came into his face, and he began to scratch at the earth. His thin hand was weak enough, but presently as they watched him, Mary, with quite breathless interest, he drove the end of the trowel into the soil and turned some over. You can do it. You can do it, said Mary to herself. I tell you, you can. Dickon's round eyes were full of eager curiousness, but he said not a word. Ben Weatherstaff looked on with interested face. Colin persevered. After he had turned a few trowelfuls of soil, he spoke exultantly to Dickon in his best Yorkshire. Thou said as thou'd have me walking about here same as other folk, and thou said thou'd have me digging. I thought thou was just leeing to please me. This is only the first day and I've walked, and here I am, digging. Ben Weatherstaff's mouth fell open again when he heard him, but he ended up chuckling. Eh, he said, that sounds as if thou'd got wits in all. Thou'rt a Yorkshire lad for sure, and thou'rt digging. How'd thou like to plant a bit of something? I can get thee a rose in a pot. Oh, go and get it, said Colin, digging excitedly. Quick, quick. It was done quickly enough indeed. Ben Weatherstaff went his way forgetting rheumatics. Dickon took his spade and dug the hole deeper and wider than a new digger with thin white hands could make it. Mary slipped out to run and bring back a watering can. When Dickon had deepened the hole, Colin went on turning the soft earth over and over. He looked up at the sky, flushed and glowing with the strangely new exercise, slight as it was. I want to do it before the sun goes quite down, he said. Mary thought that perhaps the sun held back a few minutes just on purpose. Ben Weatherstaff brought the rose in its pot from the greenhouse. He hobbled over the grass as fast as he could. He had begun to get excited too. He knelt down by the hole and broke the pot from the mould. Here, lad, he said, handing the plant to Colin. Set it in the earth thyself, same as the king does when he goes to new place. The thin white hand shook a little, and Colin's flush grew deeper as he set the rose in the mould and held it while old Ben made firm the earth. It was filled in and pressed down and made steady. Mary was leaning forward on her hands and knees. Soot had flown down and marched forward to see what was being done. Nut and shell chattered about it from a cherry tree. "It's planted," said Colin at last, "and the sun is only slipping over the edge. Help me up, Dickon. I want to be standing when it goes. That's part of the magic." And Dickon helped him, and the magic, or whatever it was, so gave him strength that when the sun did slip over the edge and end the strange, lovely afternoon for them, there he actually stood, on his 2 feet, laughing. Dr. Craven had been waiting some time at the house when they returned to it. He had indeed begun to wonder if it might not be wise to send someone out to explore the garden paths. When Colin was brought back to his room, the poor man looked him over seriously. "You should not have stayed so long," he said. "You must not overexert yourself." "I'm not tired at all," said Colin. "It has made me well. Tomorrow I'm going out in the morning as well as in the afternoon." "I'm not sure that I can allow that," answered Dr. Craven. "I'm afraid it would not be wise." "It would not be wise to try and stop me," said Colin quite seriously. "I am going." Even Mary had found out that one of Colin's chief peculiarities was that he did not know in the least what a rude little brute he was with his way of ordering people about. He had lived on a sort of desert island all his life, and as he had been the king of it, he had made his own manners and had no one to compare himself with. Mary had indeed been rather like him herself, and since she had been at Misselthwaite, had gradually discovered that her own manners had not been of the kind which is usual or popular. Having made this discovery, she naturally thought it of enough interest to communicate to Colin. So she sat and looked at him curiously for a few minutes after Dr. Craven had gone. She wanted to make him ask her why she was doing it. And of course, she did. "What are you looking at me for?" he said. "I'm thinking that I'm rather sorry for Dr. Craven." "So am I," said Colin calmly, but not without an air of some satisfaction. "He won't get Misselthwaite at all now I'm not going to die." "I'm sorry for him because of that, of course," said Mary. "But I was thinking just then that it must have been very horrid to have had to be polite for 10 years to a boy who was always rude. I would never have done it." "Am I rude?" Colin inquired undisturbedly. "If you had been his own boy, and he had been a slapping sort of man," said Mary, "he would have slapped you." "But he daren't," said Colin. "No, he daren't," answered Mistress Mary, thinking the thing out quite without prejudice. "Nobody ever dared to do anything you didn't like, because you were going to die and things like that. You were such a poor thing." "But," announced Colin stubbornly, "I'm not going to be a poor thing. I won't let people think I'm one. I stood on my feet this afternoon." "It is always having your own way that's made you so queer," Mary went on. Colin turned his head, frowning. "Am I queer?" he demanded. "Yes," answered Mary. "Very. But you shouldn't be cross," she added impartially. "Because so am I queer. And so is Ben Weatherstaff. But I'm not as queer as I was before I began to like people, and before I found the garden." "I don't want to be queer," said Colin. "I'm not going to be." And he frowned again with determination. He was a very proud boy. He lay thinking for a while, and then Mary saw his beautiful smile begin and gradually change his whole face. "I shall stop being queer," he said. "If I go every day to the garden, there's magic in there. Good magic, you know. I'm sure there is." "So am I," said Mary. "Even if it isn't real magic," Colin said, "we can pretend it is. Something is there. Something." "It's magic," said Mary. "But not black. It's as white as snow." They always called it magic, and indeed it seemed like it in the months that followed. The wonderful months, the radiant months, the amazing ones. Oh, the things which happened in that garden. If you've never had a garden, you cannot understand, and if you have had a garden, you will know that it would take a whole book to describe all that came to pass there. At first it seemed that green things would never cease pushing their way through the earth. In the grass, in the beds, even in the crevices of the walls. Then the green things began to show buds, and the buds began to unfurl and show colour. Every shade of blue, every shade of purple, every tint and hue of crimson. In its happy days, flowers had been tucked away into every inch and hole and corner. Ben Weatherstaff had seen it done, and had himself scraped out mortar from between the bricks of the wall and made pockets of earth for lovely clinging things to grow on. Iris and white lilies rose out of the grass in sheaves, and the green alcoves filled themselves with amazing armies of the blue and white flower lances of tall delphiniums or columbines or campanulas. "She was main fond of them, she was," Ben Weatherstaff said. "She liked them things as was always pointing up to blue sky. Not as she was one of them as looked down on the earth, not her. She just loved it. But she said as the blue sky always looked so joyful." The seeds Dickon and Mary had planted grew as if fairies had tended them. Satiny poppies of all tints danced in the breeze by the score, gaily defying flowers which had lived in the garden for years, and which it might be confessed seemed rather to wonder how such new people had got there. And the roses rising out of the grass, tangled round the sundial, wreathing the tree trunks and hanging from the branches, climbing up the walls and spreading over them with long garlands falling in cascades. They came alive day by day, hour by hour. Fair, fresh leaves and buds tiny at first but swelling and working magic until they burst, and uncurled into cups of scent, delicately spilling themselves over their brims and filling the garden air. Colin saw it all, watching each change as it took place. Every morning he was brought out, and every hour of each day when it didn't rain he spent in the garden. Even grey days pleased him. He would lie on the grass, watching things growing, he said. If you watched long enough, he declared, you could see buds unsheath themselves. Also, you could make the acquaintance of strange, busy insect things running about on various unknown but evidently serious errands, sometimes carrying tiny scraps of straw or feather or food, or climbing blades of grass as if they were trees, from whose tops one could look out to explore the country. A mole, throwing up its mound at the end of its burrow and making its way out at long last with the long-nailed paws which looked like elfish hands. Ants' ways, beetles' ways, bees' ways, frogs' ways, birds' ways, plants' ways gave him a new world to explore. And when Dickon revealed them all and added foxes' ways, otters' ways, ferrets' ways, squirrels' ways, and trout and water rats and badgers' ways, there was no end to the things to talk about and think over. And this was not the half of the magic. The fact that he had really once stood on his feet had set Colin thinking tremendously, and When Mary told him of the spell she had worked, he was excited and approved of it greatly. He talked of it constantly. "Of course, there must be lots of magic in the world," he said wisely one day. "But people don't know what it's like or how to make it. Perhaps in the beginning is just to say nice things are going to happen until you make them happen. I'm going to try an experiment." The next morning, when they went to the secret garden, he sent at once for Ben Weatherstaff. Ben came as quickly as he could and found the Raja standing on his feet under a tree and looking very grand, and also very beautifully smiling. "Good morning, Ben Weatherstaff," he said. "I want you and Dickon and Miss Mary to stand in a row and listen to me, because I'm going to tell you something very important." "Aye, aye, sir," answered Ben Weatherstaff, touching his forehead. One of the long-concealed charms of Ben Weatherstaff was that in his boyhood he had once run away to sea and made voyages, so he could reply like a sailor. "I'm going to try a scientific experiment," explained the Raja. "When I grow up, I'm going to make great scientific discoveries, and I'm going to begin now with this experiment." "Aye, aye, sir," said Ben Weatherstaff promptly, though this was the first time he had heard of great scientific discoveries. It was the first time Mary had heard of them either, but even at this stage she had begun to realize that, queer as he was, Colin had read about a great many singular things, and was somehow a very convincing sort of boy. When he held up his head and fixed his strange eyes on you, it seemed as if you believed him almost in spite of yourself, though he was only 10 years old. At this moment, he was especially convincing, because he suddenly felt the fascination of actually making a sort of speech like a grown-up person. "The great scientific discoveries I'm going to make," he went on, "will be about magic. Magic is a great thing, and scarcely anyone knows anything about it except a few people in old books, and Mary a little, because she was born in India, where there are fakirs. I believe Dickon knows some magic, but perhaps he doesn't know he knows it. He charms animals and people. I would never have let him come to see me if he had not been an animal charmer, which is a boy charmer too, because a boy is an animal. I am sure there is magic in everything. Only we have not sense enough to get hold of it and make it do things for us, like electricity and horses and steam." This sounded so imposing that Ben Weatherstaff became quite excited and really could not keep still. "Aye, aye, sir," he said, and he began to stand up quite straight. "When Mary found this garden, it looked quite dead. Then something began pushing things up out of the soil and making things out of nothing. One day, things weren't there, and another day they were. I had never watched things before, and it made me feel very curious. Scientific people are always curious, and I am going to be scientific. I keep saying to myself, what is it? What is it? It's something. It can't be nothing. I don't know its name, so I call it magic. I've never seen the sun rise, but Mary and Dickon have, and from what they tell me, I'm sure that is magic too. Something pushes it up and draws it. Sometimes since I've been in the garden, I've looked up through the trees at the sky, and I've had a strange feeling of being happy, as if something were pushing and drawing in my chest and making me breathe fast. Magic is always pushing and drawing and making things out of nothing. Everything is made out of magic. Leaves and trees, flowers and birds, badgers and foxes and squirrels and people. So it must be all around us, in this garden, in all the places. The magic in this garden has made me stand up, and I know I'm going to live to be a man. I'm going to make the scientific experiment of trying to get some and put it in myself and make it push and draw me and make me strong. I don't know how to do it, but I think that if you keep thinking about it and calling it, perhaps it will come. Perhaps that is the first baby way to get it. When I was going to try to stand that first time, Mary kept saying to herself as fast as she could, "You can do it. You can do it." And I did. I had to try myself at the same time, of course, but her magic helped me. And so did Dickon's. Every morning and evening, and as often in the daytime as I can remember, I'm going to say, "Magic is in me. Magic is making me well. I'm going to be as strong as Dickon. As strong as Dickon. And you must all do it too. That is my experiment. Will you help, Ben Weatherstaff?" "Aye, aye, sir," said Ben Weatherstaff. "Aye, aye." If you keep doing it every day as regularly as soldiers go through drill, we shall see what will happen, and find out if the experiment succeeds. You learn things by saying them over and over and thinking about them until they stay in your mind forever. And I think it will be the same with magic. If you keep calling it to come to you and help you, it will get to be part of you. It will stay and do things. I once heard an officer in India tell my mother there were fakirs who said words over and over thousands of times, said Mary. I've heard Jem Fettleworth's wife say the same thing over 1,000 times, calling Jem a drunken brute, said Ben Weatherstaff dryly. Summit all of us come of that, sure enough. He gave her a good hiding and went to the Blue Lion and got as drunk as a lord. Colin drew his brows together and thought a few minutes. Then he cheered up. "Well," he said, "you see, something did come of it. She used the wrong magic until she made him beat her. If she'd used the right magic and had said something nice, perhaps he wouldn't have got as drunk as a lord, and perhaps he might have bought her a new bonnet." Ben Weatherstaff chuckled, and there was a shrewd admiration in his little old eyes. "That a clever lad as well as straight-legged, Master Colin. Next time I see Bess Fettleworth, I'll give her a bit of a hint to what magic'll do for her. She'd be rare and pleased if the scientific experiment worked, and so'd Jem." Dickon had stood listening to the lecture, his round eyes shining with curious delight. Nut and Shell were on his shoulders, and he held a long-eared white rabbit in his arm, and stroked it softly while it laid its ears along its back and enjoyed itself. "Do you think the experiment will work?" Colin asked him, wondering what he was thinking. He so often wondered what Dickon was thinking when he saw him looking at him or one of his creatures with his happy wide smile. He smiled now, and his smile was wider than usual. "Aye," he answered. "That I do. It'll work same as the seeds do when the sun shines on 'em. It'll work for sure. Shall us begin it now?" Colin was delighted, and so was Mary. Fired by recollections of fakirs and devotees in illustrations, Colin suggested they should all sit cross-legged under the tree, which made a canopy. "It'll be like sitting in a sort of temple," said Colin. "I'm rather tired and I want to sit down." "Hey," said Dickon, "thou mustn't begin by saying thou art tired. Thou might spoil the magic." Colin turned and looked at him into his innocent round eyes. "That's true," he began slowly. "I must only think of the magic." It all seemed most majestic and mysterious when they sat down in their circle. Ben Weatherstaff felt as if he had somehow been led into appearing at a prayer meeting. Ordinarily, he was very fixed in being what he called, again, prayer meetings. But this being the Rajah's affair, he did not resent it, and was indeed inclined to be gratified at being called upon to assist. Mistress Mary felt solemnly enraptured. Dickon held his rabbit in his arm, and perhaps he made some charmer's signal no one heard, for when he sat down, cross-legged like the rest, the crow, the fox, the squirrels, and the lambs slowly drew near and made part of the circle, settling each into a place of rest as if of their own desire. "The creatures have come," said Colin gravely. "They want to help us." Colin really looked quite beautiful, Mary thought. He held his head high as if he felt like a sort of priest, and his strange eyes had a wonderful look in them. The light shone on him through the tree canopy. "Now we will begin," he said. "Shall we sway backward and forward, Mary, as if we were dervishes?" "I canna do no swaying backward and forward," said Ben Weatherstaff. "I've got rheumatics." "The magic will take them away," said Colin, in a high priest tone. "But we won't sway until it has done it. We will only chant." "I canna do no chanting," said Ben Weatherstaff, a trifle testily. "They turned me out of church choir only time I ever tried it." No one smiled. They were all too much in earnest. Colin's face was not even crossed by a shadow. He was only thinking of the magic. "Then I will chant," he said. And he began looking like a strange boy spirit. "The sun is shining. That is the magic. The flowers are growing. The roots are stirring. That is the magic. Being alive is the magic. Being strong is the magic. The magic is in me. The magic is in me. It is in me. It is in me. It's in every one of us. It's in Ben Weatherstaff's back. Magic, magic, come and help." He said it a great many times. Not 1,000 times, but quite a goodly number. Mary listened, entranced. She felt as if it were at once queer and beautiful, and she wanted him to go on and on. Ben Weatherstaff began to feel soothed into a sort of dream which was quite agreeable. The humming of the bees in the blossoms mingled with the chanting voice and drowsily melted into a doze. Dickon sat cross-legged with his rabbit asleep on his arm, and a hand resting on the lamb's back. Soot had pushed away a squirrel and huddled close to him on his shoulder. The grey film dropped over his eyes. At last, Colin stopped. "Now I am going to walk round the garden," he announced. Ben Weatherstaff's head had just dropped forward, and he lifted it with a jerk. "You've been asleep," said Colin. "Now to the sort," mumbled Ben. "The sermon was good enough, but I'm bound to get out for the collection." He was not quite awake yet. "You're not in church," said Colin. "Not me," said Ben, straightening himself. "Who said I were? I heard every bit of it. You said the magic was in my back. The doctor calls it rheumatics." The Rajah waved his hand. "That was the wrong magic," he said. "You will get better. You have my permission to go to your work, but come back tomorrow." "I'd like to see thee walk around the garden," grunted Ben. It was not an unfriendly grunt, but it was a grunt. In fact, being a stubborn old party and not having entire faith in magic, he had made up his mind that if he were sent away, he would climb his ladder and look over the wall, so that he might be ready to hobble back if there were any stumbling. The Rajah did not object to his staying, and so the procession was formed. It really did look like a procession. Colin was at its head, with Dickon on one side and Mary on the other. Ben Weatherstaff walked behind, and the creatures trailed after them. The lamb and the fox cub keeping close to Dickon, the white rabbit hopping along or stopping to nibble, and Soot following with the solemnity of a person who felt himself in charge. It was a procession which moved slowly, but with dignity. Every few yards it stopped to rest. Colin leaned on Dickon's arm, and privately Ben Weatherstaff kept a sharp lookout. But now and then Colin took his hand from its support and walked a few steps alone. His head was held up all the time, and he looked very grand. "The magic is in me," he kept saying. "The magic is making me strong. I can feel it. I can feel it." It seemed very certain that something was upholding and uplifting him. He sat on the seats in the alcoves, and once or twice he sat down on the grass, and several times he paused in the path and leaned on Dickon. But he would not give up, not until he had gone all round the garden. When he returned to the canopy tree, his cheeks were flushed, and he looked triumphant. "I did it. The magic worked," he cried. "That is my first scientific discovery." "What will Dr. Craven say?" broke out Mary. "He won't say anything," Colin answered. "Because he will not be told. This is to be the biggest secret of all. No one is to know anything about it until I have grown so strong that I can walk and run like any other boy. I shall come here every day in my chair, and I shall be taken back in it. I won't have people whispering and asking questions, and I won't let my father hear about it until the experiment has quite succeeded. Then, sometime when he comes back to Misselthwaite, I shall just walk into his study and say, 'Here I am. I'm like any other boy. I am quite well, and I shall live to be a man. It has been done by a scientific experiment.'" "He'll think he's in a dream," cried Mary. "He won't believe his eyes." Colin flushed triumphantly. He had made himself believe that he was going to get well, which was really more than half the battle if he had been aware of it. The thought which stimulated him more than any other was this imagining what his father would look like when he saw that he had a son who was as straight and strong as other fathers' sons. One of his darkest miseries in the unhealthy, morbid past days had been his hatred of being a sickly, weak-backed boy whose father was afraid to look at him. "He'll be obliged to believe them," he said. "One of the things I'm going to do after the magic works, and before I begin to make scientific discoveries, is to be an athlete." "We shall have thee taken to boxing in a week or so," said Ben Weatherstaff. "That'll end with winning the belt and being champion prize fighter of all England." Colin fixed his eyes on him sternly. "Weatherstaff," he said, "that is disrespectful. You must not take liberties because you are in the secret. However much the magic works, I shall not be a prize fighter. I shall be a scientific discoverer." "Ax pardon, sir," answered Ben, touching his forehead in salute. "I ought to have seen it wasn't a joking matter." But his eyes twinkled. Secretly, he was immensely pleased. He really did not mind being snubbed, since the snubbing meant that the lad was gaining strength and spirit. The secret garden was not the only one that Dickon worked in. Round the cottage on the moor, there was a piece of ground enclosed by a low wall of rough stones. Early in the morning, and late in the fading twilight, and on all the days Colin and Mary did not see him, Dickon worked there, planting or tending potatoes and cabbages, turnips and carrots and herbs for his mother. In the company of his creatures, he did wonders there, and was never tired of doing them, it seemed. While he dug or weeded, he whistled or sang bits of Yorkshire moor songs, or talked to Soot or Captain, or the brothers and sisters he had taught to help him. "We'd never get on as comfortable as we do," Mrs. Sowerby said, "if it wasn't for Dickon's garden. Anything'll grow for him. His taters and cabbages is twice the size of anyone else's, and they've got flavour with them as nobody's has." When she found a moment to spare, she liked to go out and talk to him. After supper, there was still a long, clear twilight to work in, and that was her quiet time. She could sit upon the low, rough wall and look on and hear stories of the day. She loved this time. there were not only vegetables in this garden. Dickon had bought penny packages of flower seeds now and then, and sown bright, sweet-scented things among gooseberry bushes and even cabbages, and he grew borders of mignonette and pinks and pansies and things whose seeds he could save year after year, or whose roots would bloom each spring and spread in time into fine clumps. The low wall was one of the prettiest things in Yorkshire, because he had tucked moorland foxglove and ferns and rock cress and hedgerow flowers into every crevice, until only here and there glimpses of the stones were to be seen. "All a chap's got to do to make 'em thrive, mother," he would say, "is to be friends with 'em for sure. They're just like the creatures. If they're thirsty, give 'em drink, and if they're hungry, give 'em a bit of food. They want to live, same as we do. If they died, I should feel as if I'd been a bad lad and somehow treated them heartless." It was in these twilight hours that Mrs. Sowerby heard of all that happened at Misselthwaite Manor. At first she was only told that Mr. Colin had taken a fancy to going out into the grounds with Miss Mary, and that it was doing him good. But it was not long before it was agreed between the two children that Dickon's mother might come into the secret. Somehow, it was not doubted that she was safe for sure. So one beautiful still evening, Dickon told the whole story, with all the thrilling details of the buried key, and the robin, and the grey haze which seemed like deadness, the secret Mistress Mary had planned never to reveal. The coming of Dickon, how it had been told to him, the doubt of Mr. Colin, and the final drama of his introduction to the hidden domain, combined with the incident of Ben Weatherstaff's angry face peering over the wall, and Mr. Colin's sudden indignant strength. Mrs. Sowerby's nice-looking face quite changed colour several times. "My word," she said, "it was a good thing that little lass came to the manor. It's been the making of her and the saving of him, standing on his feet, and us all thinking he was a poor half-witted lad with not a straight bone in him." She asked a great many questions, and her blue eyes were full of deep thinking. "What do they make of it at manor, him being so well and cheerful and never complaining?" "They don't know what to make of it," answered Dickon. "Every day as comes round his face looks different. It's filling out and doesn't look so sharp and the waxy colour's going. But he has to do a bit of complaining," with a highly entertained grin. "What for, our mercy's name?" asked Mrs. Sowerby. Dickon chuckled. "He does it to keep them guessing. If the doctor knew he'd found out he could stand on his feet, he'd likely write and tell Mr. Craven. Mr. Colin's saving the secret to tell himself. He's going to practice his magic on his legs every day till his father comes back. Then he's going to march into his room, then show him he's as straight as other lads. But him and Miss Mary think it's best plan to do a bit of groaning and fretting now and then to throw folk off the scent." Mrs. Sowerby was laughing, a low, comfortable laugh, long before he had finished his last sentence. "Eh," she said, "that pair's enjoying theirselves, I'll warrant. They'll get a good bit of acting out of it, and there's nothing children like as much as play acting. Let's hear what they do, Dickon, lad." Dickon stopped weeding and sat up on his heels to tell her. His eyes were twinkling with fun. "Mr. Colin's carried down to his chair every time he goes out, and he flies out at John the footman for not carrying him careful enough. He makes himself as helpless looking as he can, and he never lifts his head until we're out of sight of house. And he grunts and frets a good bit when he's being settled into his chair. Him and Miss Mary both got to enjoying it, and when he groans and complains, she'll say, 'Poor Colin, does it hurt you so much? Are you so weak as that, poor Colin?' But the trouble is that sometimes they can scarce keep from bursting out laughing. When we get safe into the garden, They laugh till they've got no breath left to laugh with, and they have to stuff their faces into Mr. Collins's cushions to keep the gardeners from hearing. The more they laugh, the better for 'em, said Mrs. Sowerby, still laughing herself. Good healthy child laughing's better than pills any day a year. That pair'll plump up for sure. They are plumping up, said Dickon. They're that hungry they don't know how to get enough to eat without making talk. Mr. Collins says if he keeps sending for more food, they won't believe he's an invalid at all. Miss Mary says she'll let him eat her share, but he says that if she goes hungry, she'll get thin, and their mun both get fat at once. Mrs. Sowerby laughed, so heartily at the revelation of this difficulty that she quite rocked backward and forward in her blue cloak, and Dickon laughed with her. I'll tell thee what, lad, Mrs. Sowerby said when she could speak. I've thought of a way to help 'em. When thou goes to 'em in the morning, thou shall take a pail of good new milk, and I'll bake 'em a crusty cottage loaf, or some buns with currants in 'em, same as you children like. Nothing's so good as fresh milk and bread. Then they could take off the edge of their hunger while they were in the garden, and the fine food they get indoors would polish off the corners. Hey, mother, said Dickon admiringly. What a wonder thou art. Thou always sees a way out of things. They was quite in a pother yesterday. They didn't see how they was to manage without ordering up more food. They felt that empty inside. They're two young uns growing fast, and health's coming back to 'em. Children like that feel like young wolves and food's flesh and blood to 'em, said Mrs. Sowerby. Then she smiled, Dickon's own curving smile. Hey, but they're enjoying themselves for sure, she said. She was quite right. The comfortable, wonderful mother creature. And she had never been more so than when she said their play-acting would be their joy. Colin and Mary found it one of their most thrilling sources of entertainment. The idea of protecting themselves from suspicion had been unconsciously suggested to them first by the puzzled nurse, and then by Dr. Craven himself. Your appetite's improving very much, Master Colin, the nurse had said one day. You used to eat nothing, and so many things disagreed with you. Nothing disagrees with me now, replied Colin. And then seeing the nurse looking at him curiously, he suddenly remembered that perhaps he ought not to appear too well just yet. At least, things don't so often disagree with me. It's the fresh air. Perhaps it is, said the nurse, still looking at him with a mystified expression. But I must talk to Dr. Craven about it. How she stared at you, said Mary when she went away, as if she thought there must be something to find out. I won't have her finding out things, said Colin. No one must begin to find out yet. When Dr. Craven came that morning, he seemed puzzled also. He asked a number of questions to Colin's great annoyance. You stay out in the garden a great deal, he suggested. Where do you go? Colin put on his favourite air of dignified indifference to opinion. I will not let anyone know where I go, he answered. I go to a place I like. Everyone has orders to keep out of the way. I won't be watched and stared at. You know that. You seem to be out all day, but I do not think it's done you harm. I do not think so. The nurse says you eat much more than you have ever done before. Perhaps, said Colin, prompted by a sudden inspiration. Perhaps it is an unnatural appetite. I do not think so, as your food seems to agree with you, said Dr. Craven. You're gaining flesh rapidly, and your colour is better. Perhaps I'm bloated and feverish, said Colin, assuming a discouraging air of gloom. People who are not going to live are often different. Dr. Craven shook his head. He was holding Colin's wrist, and he pushed up his sleeve and felt his arm. You're not feverish, he said thoughtfully. And such flesh as you have gained is healthy. If you keep this up, my boy, we need not talk of dying. Your father will be happy to hear of this remarkable improvement." "I won't have him told," Colin broke forth fiercely. "It will only disappoint him if I get worse again. And I may get worse this very night. I might have a raging fever. I feel as if I might be beginning to have one now. I won't have letters written to my father. I won't. You're making me angry, and you know that's bad for me. I feel hot already. I hate being written about and being talked over as much as I hate being stared at." "Hush, my boy," Dr. Craven soothed him. "Nothing shall be written without your permission. You are too sensitive about things. You must not undo the good which has been done." He said no more about writing to Mr. Craven, and when he saw the nurse, he privately warned her that such a possibility must not be mentioned to the patient. "The boy is extraordinarily better," he said. "His advance seems almost abnormal. But of course he's doing now of his own free will what we could not make him do before. Still, he excites himself very easily, and nothing must be said to irritate him." Mary and Colin were much alarmed, and talked together anxiously. From this time dated their plan of play-acting. "I may be obliged to have a tantrum," said Colin regretfully. "I don't want to have one, and I'm not miserable enough now to work myself into a big one. Perhaps I couldn't have one at all. That lump doesn't come in my throat now, and I keep thinking of nice things instead of horrible ones. But if they talk about writing to my father, I shall have to do something." He made up his mind to eat less, but unfortunately it was not possible to carry out this brilliant idea when he wakened each morning with an amazing appetite, and the table near his sofa was set with a breakfast of homemade bread and fresh butter, snow-white eggs, raspberry jam and clotted cream. Mary always breakfasted with him, and when they found themselves at the table, particularly if there were delicate slices of sizzling ham, sending forth tempting odours from under a hot silver cover, they would look into each other's eyes in desperation. "I think we shall have to eat it all this morning, Mary," Colin always ended by saying. "We can send away some of the lunch and a great deal of the dinner." But they never found they could send away anything, and the highly polished condition of the empty plates returned to the pantry awakened much comment. "I do wish," Colin would say, "I do wish the slices of ham were thicker. And one muffin each is not enough for anyone." "It's enough for a person who's going to die," answered Mary when she first heard this. "But it's not enough for a person who's going to live. I sometimes feel as if I could eat 3 when those nice fresh heather and gorse smells from the moor come pouring in at the open window." The morning that Dickon, after they had been enjoying themselves in the garden for about 2 hours, went behind a big rose bush and brought forth 2 tin pails, and revealed that one was full of rich new milk with cream on top of it, and that the other held cottage-made currant buns folded in a clean blue and white napkin, buns so carefully tucked in that they were still hot. There was a riot of surprised joyfulness. What a wonderful thing for Mrs. Sowerby to think of. What a kind, clever woman she must be. How good the buns were. And what delicious fresh milk. "Magic is in her just as it is in Dickon," said Colin. "It makes her think of ways to do things, nice things. She is a magic person. Tell her we're grateful, Dickon, extremely grateful." He was given to using rather grown-up phrases at times. He enjoyed them. He liked this so much he improved upon it. "Tell her she has been most bounteous, and our gratitude is extreme." And then, forgetting his grandeur, he fell to, and stuffed himself with buns, and drank milk out of the pail in copious draughts, in the manner of any hungry little boy who had been taking unusual exercise and breathing in moorland air, and whose breakfast was more than 2 hours behind him. This was the beginning of many agreeable incidents of the same kind. They actually awoke to the fact that as Mrs. Sowerby had 14 people to provide food for, she might not have enough to satisfy 2 extra appetites every day. So they asked her to let them send some of their shillings to buy things. Dickon made the stimulating discovery that in the wood in the park outside the garden, where Mary had first found him piping to the wild creatures, there was a deep little hollow where you could build a sort of tiny oven with stones and roast potatoes and eggs in it. Roasted eggs were a previously unknown luxury, and very hot potatoes with salt and fresh butter in them were fit for a woodland king, besides being deliciously satisfying. You could buy both potatoes and eggs and eat as many as you liked without feeling as if you were taking food out of the mouths of 14 people. Every beautiful morning, the magic was worked by the mystic circle under the plum tree, which provided a canopy of thickening green leaves. After the ceremony, Colin always took his walking exercise, and throughout the day he exercised his newly found power at intervals. Each day, he grew stronger, and could walk more steadily, and cover more ground, and each day, his belief in the magic grew stronger, as well it might. He tried one experiment after another, as he felt himself gaining strength, and it was Dickon who showed him the best things of all. "Yesterday," he said one morning after an absence, "I went to Thwaite for mother, and near the Blue Cow Inn I seed Bob Airworth. He's the strongest chap on moor. He's champion wrestler, and he can jump higher than any other chap and throw a hammer further. He's gone all the way to Scotland for sport some years. He's knowed me ever since I was a little un, and he's a friendly sort, and I asked him some questions. The gentry calls him athlete, and I thought of thee, Master Colin, and I says, 'How did thou make the muscles stick out that way, Bob? Did thou do anything extra to make thyself so strong?' And he says, 'Well, yes, lad, I did. A strong man in a show came to Thwaite once, showed me how to exercise me arms and legs and every muscle in my body.' And I says, 'Could a delicate chap make himself stronger with them, Bob?' And he laughed and says, 'Art thou the delicate chap?' And I says, 'No, but I knows a young gentleman that's getting well of a long illness, and I wish I knowed some of them tricks to tell him about.' I didn't say no names, and he didn't ask none. He's friendly, same as I said, and stood up and showed me good-natured like, and I imitated what he did, till I knowed it by heart." Colin had been listening excitedly. "Can you show me?" he cried. "Will you?" "Aye, to be sure," Dickon answered, getting up. "But he says thou mun do 'em gentle at first, and be careful not to tire thyself. Rest in between times and take deep breaths, and don't overdo." "I'll be careful," said Colin. Show me, Dickon. You are the most magic boy in the world." Dickon stood up on the grass and slowly went through a carefully practical but simple series of muscle exercises. Colin watched them with widening eyes. He could do a few while he was sitting down. Presently he did a few gentle while he stood upon his already steadied feet. Mary began to do them also. Soot, who was watching the performance, became much disturbed and left his branch. He hopped about restlessly because he could not do them too. From that time, the exercises were part of the day's duties as much as the magic was. It became possible for both Colin and Mary to do more of them each time they tried, and such appetites were the results that, but for the basket Dickon put down behind the bush each morning, would have been lost. But the little oven in the hollow and Mrs. Sowerby's bounties were so satisfying that Mrs. Medlock and the nurse and Dr. Craven became mystified again. You can trifle with your breakfast and seem to disdain your dinner if you are full to the brim with roasted eggs and potatoes and richly frothed new milk and oatcakes and buns and heather honey and clotted cream. "They're eating next to nothing," said the nurse. "They'll die of starvation if they can't be persuaded to take some nourishment. And yet see how they look." "Look," exclaimed Mrs. Medlock indignantly. "I'm moithered to death with them. They're a pair of young Satans, bursting their jackets one day and next turning up their noses at best meals cook can tempt them with. Not a mouthful of that lovely young fowl and bread sauce did they set fork into yesterday, and the poor woman fair invented a pudding for them, and back it sent. She almost cried. She's afraid she'll be blamed if they starve themselves into graves." Dr. Craven came and looked at Colin, long and carefully. He wore an extremely worried expression when the nurse talked with him and showed him the almost untouched tray of breakfast she had saved for him to look at. But it was even more worried when he sat down by Colin's sofa and examined him. He had been called to London on business and had not seen the boy for nearly 2 weeks. When young things begin to gain health, they gain it rapidly. The waxen tinge had left. Colin's skin had a warm rose showed through it. His beautiful eyes were clear, and the hollows under them and in his cheeks and temples had filled out. His once dark, heavy locks had begun to look as if they sprang healthily from his forehead and were soft and warm with life. His lips were fuller and of a normal colour. In fact, as an imitation of a boy who was a confirmed invalid, he was a disgraceful sight. Dr. Craven held his chin in his hands and thought him over. "I am sorry to hear that you do not eat anything," he said. "That will not do. You will lose all you've gained. You've gained amazingly. You ate so well a short time ago." "I told you it was an unnatural appetite," answered Colin. Mary was sitting on her stool nearby, and she suddenly made a very queer sound, which she tried so violently to repress that she ended up almost choking. "What's the matter?" said Dr. Craven, turning to look at her. Mary became quite severe in her manner. "It was something between a sneeze and a cough," she replied with reproachful dignity, "and it got in my throat." "But afterwards," she said to Colin, "I couldn't stop myself. It just burst out because all at once I couldn't help remembering that last big potato you ate. The way your mouth stretched when you bit through that thick, lovely crust with jam and clotted cream on it." "Is there any way in which those children can get food secretly?" Dr. Craven inquired of Mrs. Medlock. "There's no way unless they dig it out of the earth or pick it off the trees," Mrs. Medlock answered. "They stay out in the grounds all day and see no one but each other. And if they want anything different to eat from what's sent up to them, they need only ask for it." "Well," said Dr. Craven, "so long as going without food agrees with them, we need not disturb ourselves. The boy is a new creature." "So is the girl," said Mrs. Medlock. "She's begun to be downright pretty since she filled out and lost her ugly little sour look. Her hair's grown thick and healthy looking, and she's got a bright colour. The glummest, ill-natured little thing she used to be, and now her and Master Colin laugh together like a pair of crazy young ones. Perhaps they're growing fat on that." "Perhaps they are," said Dr. Craven. "Let them laugh." And the secret garden bloomed and bloomed, and every morning revealed new miracles. In the robin's nest there were eggs, and the robin's mate sat upon them, keeping them warm with her feathery little breast and careful wings. At first she was very nervous, and the robin himself was indignantly watchful. Even Dickon did not go near the close-grown corner in those days, but waited until by the quiet working of some mysterious spell, he seemed to have conveyed to the soul of the little pair that in the garden there was nothing which was not quite like themselves, nothing which did not understand the wonderfulness of what was happening to them, the immense, tender, terrible, heartbreaking beauty and solemnity of eggs. If there had been one person in that garden who had not known through all his or her innermost being that if an egg were taken away or hurt, the whole world would whirl round and crash through space and come to an end. If there had been even one who did not feel it and act accordingly, there could have been no happiness, even in that golden springtime air. But they all knew it and felt it, and the robin and his mate knew they knew it. At first, the robin watched Mary and Colin with sharp anxiety. For some mysterious reason, he knew he need not watch Dickon. The first moment he set his dew-bright black eye on Dickon, he knew he was not a stranger, but a sort of robin without beak or feathers. He could speak robin, which is quite a distinct language, not to be mistaken for any other. To speak robin to a robin is like speaking French to a Frenchman. Dickon always spoke it to the robin himself, so the queer gibberish that he spoke to humans did not matter in the least. The robin thought he spoke this gibberish to them because they were not intelligent enough to understand feathered speech. His movements also were robin. They never startled one by being sudden enough to seem dangerous or threatening. Any robin could understand Dickon, so his presence was not even disturbing. But at the outset, it seemed necessary to be on guard against the other two. In the first place, the boy creature did not come into the garden on his legs. He was pushed in on a thing with wheels, and the skins of wild animals were thrown over him. That in itself was doubtful. Then, when he began to stand up and move about, he did it in a queer, unaccustomed way, and the others seemed to have to help him. The robin used to secret himself in a bush and watch this anxiously, his head tilted first on one side and then on the other. He thought that the slow movements might mean he was preparing to pounce as cats do. When cats are preparing to pounce, they creep over the ground very slowly. The robin talked this over with his mate a great deal for a few days, but after that he decided not to speak of the subject. Her terror was so great he was afraid it might be injurious to the eggs. When the boy began to walk by himself and even to move more quickly, it was an immense relief. But for a long time, or it seemed a long time to the robin, he was a source of some anxiety. He did not act as the other humans did. He seemed very fond of walking, but he had a way of sitting or lying down for a while, and then getting up in a disconcerting manner to begin again. One day, the robin remembered that when he himself had been made to learn to fly by his parents, he had done much the same sort of thing. He had taken short flights of a few yards, and then had been obliged to rest. So it occurred to him that this boy was learning to fly, or rather, to walk. He mentioned this to his mate, and when he told her that the eggs would probably conduct themselves in the same way after they were fledged, she was quite comforted, and even became eagerly interested, and derived great pleasure from watching the boy over the edge of her nest, though she always thought that the eggs would be much cleverer and learn more quickly. But then she said indulgently that humans were always more clumsy and slow than eggs, and most of them never seemed really to learn to fly at all. You never met them in the air or on treetops. After a while, the boy began to move about as the others did. But all three of the children at times did unusual things. They would stand under the trees and move their arms and legs and heads about in a way which was neither walking nor running nor sitting down. They went through these movements at intervals every day, and the robin was never able to explain to his mate what they were doing or trying to do. He could only say that he was sure that the eggs would never flap about in such a manner. But as the boy who could speak robin so fluently was doing the thing with them, birds could be quite sure that the actions were not of a dangerous nature. Of course, neither the robin nor his mate had ever heard of the champion wrestler Bob Horworth and his exercises for making muscles stand out like lumps. Thank you for listening to this reading of The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgeson Burnett. If you're still awake, head over to the main page and find another book to get you down to sleep. Or maybe the next part of this one is out right now. Until next time, thanks for listening. Good night.